So special thanks to Steven and to Michaela for inviting me and to curating the show as a guest and inviting me to that, and to Chris Daly, and to all of you out here from Penn State. Without Penn State, I wouldn't be where I am today. Whew. Okay, so I have a lot of images. I'm going to whip through them rather quick in some spots, and if you say slow down, I will, but you know, there's nothing worse than a long, boring lecture, so I'm going to whip it into shape here. So my first image is, this is kind of important to me because when I was younger, I didn't know that I was an artist. My father, who's in the audience, is a designer, and he really was the artist of the family and led us through some artistic projects, but I was encouraged to study and be an academic. And my punk rock look there, that's from high school, '86. That was my artistic expression, and it's significant, although my parents hated it. It was a lot to do with personal expression when that was the only medium I had. So I call this vestigial tales, forward and back. I feel like my entire life is about going forward and a step back, and going forward and a step back, but there's nothing all that linear about it. I put this picture in here because my mother drove a '57 Chevy, and I'm not sure if this is any of the years of the Corvettes my dad had, but he had plenty, and it was cars that brought them together. And to this day, I love classic cars, and I study the details, and I study the form, and I think about aerodynamics, and I think about the details around the gasoline tank opening or the headlights. And in this era, cars weren't just simply about getting you somewhere, they were about style. And you know, that's something that's sort of lost in car design today. I went through high school as an academic, graduated valedictorian behind my sister who was valedictorian, and I was very competitive from an early age in that way of academics. And so I applied to Penn State for aerospace engineering. And I got in, remarkably, when I think about it now. But there was an advisor here named Dory LeMay. Does she still work here? No. I love Dory LeMay. And another advisor at the time, and they advised me to follow my passion. And when I started going through the course book, I realized that I was stopped at anthropology and archaeology, and I was only in letter A. They told me I can only have one elective as an aerospace engineer, so I went into the undecided major, which I don't know if that still exists, but I hid there for most of my university time. And I show you these images not because of war, but because this is a vessel to me as well. And when I was in school, in grade school, I built those little rocket ships that you send up into space, a little parachute guy in them and a gasoline tank, and I detailed those, and I did car models. So I always had an eye for fine detail and putting things together in the sense of craft. Little did I know that there was potters out there making work like I envisioned in my dreams. And this is one of my favorite potters, one of the first I actually studied as a student here at Penn State, for the aerodynamic feeling, that sort of rocket ship outer space vessel. And here she is down here at the bottom. She's no longer with us. But very early on, Chris Daly encouraged us to study the history of ceramics. And whenever I engage with students myself, I encourage them to study the history, even if they want to talk about the most contemporary issues in the world or street art or whatever it might be. In ceramics, the history roots us. We were also assigned a project to look at somebody within the last 100 years of ceramics. And this was the first potter I responded to very strongly, Hans Koper, very modern to this day, kind of architectural feeling. But what really captured me was, how does he make these things? How do you take something off the wheel that's round and make it into a shape that doesn't have that same orientation? And I was just mystified by these. And I spent a lot of my first couple of throwing classes trying to figure out how to imitate this work and what the process was exactly. Similarly, these pieces incorporate history and also the more current Betty Woodman. And I love looking in her vessel next to the historic pots and seeing how she brought to it something a little more personal, something that involves history with the Tang Dynasty glazing, but also this pinching off of the air at the end that just gave it more life than those earlier pots. And I love these Xing pots because they reveal the surface is clay. There's no glaze on these pieces, and they are worked with such a fine detail, fine tools, miniature little dentist tools, that the surface of the clay speaks about clay, but also a lot of other details. It imitates a lot of the things in nature often. So I was immediately fascinated with the idea of finding a clay body that I didn't have to cover up with that kind of layer of snow. Very early on, I was sort of caught on to this. So these are some of my own pots, really stripped down. In fact, there's no glaze, and they're not even glaze fired, they're bisqued. But I had a photographer come through my studio who wasn't a clay artist, and he was so attracted to this work that he made me stop and look at it closer. He kept saying, "I love your white series." Swiss German guy. And I didn't understand what my white series was because I'd never made one, but he got me to look at my own forms in a way without a layer of glaze on them like no one had before. When I went through graduate school, and I'm not doing a linear presentation as far as time goes, so I apologize. Mine's going to be a little more about idea here. So I went to graduate school on fire for this idea of imitating antique irons. I'd stumbled upon a display in New York City at a dry cleaner's, and I was totally obsessed with the quirky, mysterious-looking objects. These were some of the ones I was looking at, and I was trying to find a way, before I knew a name for it, just sort of how to recreate these in clay, represent them. And Leslie Farron, who works with Farron Gallery, she developed the term re-objectification for me. And this is a way that I could turn these objects into something else. So I wanted to make them into a vessel that had a function, such as a teapot. And a teapot for a potter is the epitome of form and function and design all coming together, and often content can be a huge part of it. So I set about making these for all 3 years of graduate school. I still made some functional pots, which you'll see more of my pots in a little while, but I became obsessed early on with making things that were a little more one of a kind, and I developed this technique throwing just a big open donut ring and cutting it up so that I could make a three-sided pyramidal form. I love the way these Richard Serra pieces relate in idea. They're enormous in scale compared to my smaller works, but they stand up in that same way that my works did from cutting them out from that donut ring. And I looked at these strange ones and couldn't figure out a way to turn it into a teapot. That one looked like a butter dish, so I took a bronze casting class and I learned how to cast a bronze trivet for it, and you lift that whole lid up and it's this sort of kind of eccentric butter dish. And I got teased a lot in graduate school, and you all know what that's like if you're in school. Everybody will, kind of pick on you if you become obsessed with an idea. But I think obsession with your artwork is important. So I bought some of these when I lived in Indiana. There's tons of them in the Midwest. And I just didn't know what to do with these two. They were particularly challenging because there was no way for me to design a teapot from this where something could travel through these little tiny tubes. It just didn't make sense. So I made it into a creamer and sugar. And you can lift the little creamer off the dish, and they were a little more clever than they were functional. But I always walked on the balance beam between function and sculptural concerns, but I never could really commit to one or the other. And I was always encouraged to sort of choose one, but I kept functional pots going alongside these pots all along. This is a fluter. This is what they use to make the collars for the English royalty when they make those ruffly kind of French fry collars. And I just thought that was such a curious little object, and it got me thinking about corrugated sheet steel, corrugated cardboard, corrugated all that stuff, or accordions. I just found that to be really a fun and obsessive way to change the form. And I often, within my functional work, do the same thing. I'll come up with one basic form, and then I'll add something to it. I'll texturize it, or I'll square it off, or I'll make it a little bit zigzaggy like this. So at this point, I was sort of exiting graduate school, and these were resolved, in my opinion. They now had a very functional aerodynamic feel. They pour. You can take the lid off. You can actually get a kettle and a funnel in there somewhere if you want. You could pour tea from these. And I started to repeat the solution. When you repeat a solution over and over, it's sort of a clue to move on. Move on I did. I moved straight to California out of graduate school, and I'd been in Canada and Colorado and England and all sorts of places in between, but something in my heart told me to move to California. And as an artist out of graduate school, it seems like a foolish idea. Everybody will tell you it's the most expensive city to live in other than New York. And as a potter, how am I going to support myself? If I would have let my fear get in the way, I wouldn't be here in front of you. I just was fearless that the punk rocker in me just pushed me on. So I was really lucky to meet these two young women down on the left there, Mary Markeenan and Ray Dunn. And they had literally just opened this business with a third partner who decided she just couldn't cut it. She just didn't want to do this volunteer work anymore. So she left and I joined them. They had cast their own concrete pedestals, built these shelves. And for 7 years, we were in business together in a collaborative way and also in a sort of work trade way where we set up a business where the The profits from the gallery funded the rent on the studio, so we didn't pay any rent out of our pockets ever. And the three of us ran the gallery 364 days a year. We only were allowed to close on Christmas. It taught me a lot, and simultaneously I started doing these demonstrations. So this is just a quick little image of me demonstrating how to make an iron teapot or how to make a pitcher. I do demonstrations all over the country and all over the world now to fund my life. I'm not a full-time teacher at any school, and I can't support myself solely off my work necessarily, so I get about maybe 60% income from my work and 40% from the workshops. They're a huge part of my life. This is in another aspect of my life equally important, the art stream. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's a mobile ceramic art gallery, and I've been part of this project now since the year 2001 as a grassroots volunteer participant. And volunteering your time is always rewarding, even though it seems at the time like maybe a crazy idea to give up your time to other people. For 12 years now, I've traveled across the country with this. I've flown myself to meet up with it. I've paid for tickets all over the place to meet up and drag it around. We call ourselves the roadies for the rock stars. The pots are the rock stars. We were the roadies. We just dragged stuff around, had to pack up the entire vehicle and set it up every time we moved to a new location. But the concept was to bring the work directly to the people rather than trying to convince someone to come in and look at your artwork. This was a way that people just stumbled upon it. Now it's kind of funny, but what we did after about 10 years was we expanded the project to include a ceramic lending library of cups, which has been an incredible educational tool for people. And also for us, we're archiving all evidences of use. This is an example of someone who submitted an image using my cup. The only requirement in borrowing a cup for 1 week, it's free, is to submit some piece, whether it's a photo, a poem, a song, a video, something to do with your experience with that cup, to our archives, and we have archived everybody's use of all of these pieces. I'm putting this in here for a reason. This was when we were younger, and we had energy, something I don't have so much of anymore. But when the time was, this is all about timing in life, to encounter the art stream and for 12 years be a part of this, it brought my reputation up. So out of the 6 to 24 people that participate in this, we all move up together like this up, it's like one person goes up, drags the other up. So my reputation as a ceramic artist is, I'm indebted to Allegheny Meadows and my cohorts in this project, for helping spread the word about each other around. We're kind of a pack. And this is what I started making. So it seems like going back in time, but in actuality, my work, like I said, goes forward and back. And so I really addressed functional pots at this time. I knew I was going to be taking things around in a trailer a lot. I knew that I was going to be selling things at Fisherman's Wharf where people came to buy gifts for their housekeeper or their pet sitter. But people weren't committing to large-scale, expensive works at this point in my life. So I went to the market and I started making things sort of like I was making in grad school or undergrad here and there, but I tried to really refine things and get my own voice. So these are some of the pots I made. Nobody ever wanted to buy this box. They just wanted the tea bowl. That's like the difference between academia and the market. It's hard to sell the things that are the most interesting. So I would bend a little sideways for people and make things with curly cues. They sold better if they had some decorative element. But I was still dealing with this kind of monochromatic look, which I call the East Coast aesthetic. I live in California now where the funk art movement is really still prevalent. You can see it in all the work. So at this time, here I am in California, and I'm making white, quiet work that resounds much better with people along the East Coast than it does in the West Coast. So I really struggled at this point. I thought, I think I'm making gorgeous pots. Why isn't anybody really snatching them all up? I'd experiment with prices and form and everything, but finally I experimented with color. So this is a show that really opened my eyes. It's a bookstore that's secondhand in San Francisco. It's a very famous bookstore, Adobe. It's been there forever. It stinks. It smells like mothballs when you walk in there. They let this artist rearrange all the books by color. And they said they sold more books that month than they ever had in their history. So what that says to me is that the rainbow is a powerful tool. And people respond to the rainbow, right? No matter how many times you've seen the rainbow, it's always a miracle to see one. You see a double rainbow, double miracle, right? So they said putting these books back in order by number was the most painful thing they ever did in their, in their existence. But I went about testing color. So when you're in ceramics and you do glaze testing, it's torturously disappointing. It's like being a scientist and having all of your experiments go awry. Nothing ever turns out like you hope, and you have to test about 1,000 glazes to get maybe 5 that you like. So I brightened it up. And to me, I was having a hard time even looking at this work, having been from a more sort of quiet background. But I made a lot of bright work, tried to slow people down. And I started bringing the corrugated stuff back in. And I always think of work as being sort of a hybrid thing, where you hybridize your own ideas back and forth, forward and back. So this kind of thing. Looking at pictures in ceramics, to me, was so boring. There were so many that looked the same. They had these little spouts pulled out of a lip and a strap handle, and I just couldn't stand them. So I invented my own sort of picture, and I took the handle from starter pistols, from guns. And it wasn't about the gun. It was about the way a handle bends from the barrel. So that's got that kind of barrel handle. I did a very brief modeling stint with Carhartt, and the only reason I bring this up is because in the seminar to follow this, we're going to be talking a lot about professional practice. I will try anything to get my name out there, and I didn't solicit this. This came to me rather randomly, and I did a real people that wear Carhartt kind of photo shoot for them. It didn't pay much. People were complaining, the other models, about not getting them. For me, it was an idea about branding, cross-marketing. Like, how's this good? This was in People magazine. How's that going to affect a ceramic artist's career? Okay, Anish Kapoor. I could show about 1,000 images of his and I wouldn't be bored, but, but I'll just show you a few. These appeal to me for their mystery of surface. Are they hard? Are they pulled taut? Is it a stretchy material? Is it pushing the walls apart, or are they pushing it in? Mystery and optical illusion drive me. This piece is so fascinating. If you've never seen it, look it up on the internet, because a 40-ton block of wax was pushed through the doorways of this museum, and all of the edges of the doorways get covered in red wax. And only somebody as famous as Anish Kapoor could destroy a gallery like this, but they moved it through all these different rooms, and you can look on the internet and see tons of interesting pictures of this. It's about process. This one appeals to me a lot, not to everybody, but this has a lot to do with the work I'm interested in right now. It's wax also. And he sticks with this red wax idea a lot. And I think with artists, it is important to have some sort of continuity through your work, and it's not always easy. So here he is, the people in the gallery got to fire wax at the wall. This got set up in all different sorts of places as well. So there's great shots of that on the internet as well. This is my work. So I guess it's about the time that conflicts in Syria started, I became fascinated with the idea of why people fetishize a grenade or a gun or a sword. They're seen as beautiful objects. People are fascinated by them. They're killing instruments. The other thing about a grenade that's so fascinating is the word comes from pomegranate. It's from a French word for pomegranate, because the soldiers early on in the World War I thought that a grenade looked like a pomegranate. That's a life force, a fruit. This is a death force, a grenade that you hold in the hand. That kind of stuff just drives me to, through curiosity, to explore it further. So this is a set of nesting grenades I made after the Russian nesting dolls. There was a store of those across from my studio for 7 years that we laughed about. And then in the end, I ended up making a set of Russian nesting dolls, and then I translated it one step further to something that an American would maybe respond to, whether it's, frightened or feeling or whatever, terror. It's something to get people to think about. So I made that. And then I made teapots. And this harkens back to the history of ceramics, because there's a culture, moche, that we know, these stirrup pots you see in museums with the big round ring in between things. So I was playing off that idea. And then a collector told me it didn't look grenade-like enough. There's a very serious teapot collector out there by the name of Sonny Cam, and he asked me to make one that looked more like a real teapot, or a real grenade. So I made this. It took me a year to get back to making these after he asked me to do that. I don't always go, yes, sir, but I wanted to make something for this guy, and I wanted to make it right. So I took about a year and thought about it. And I added an actual steel ring so the pin pulls out. They don't pour so great. There's still some issues, but at this point, it's really a pedestal teapot. It's just meant to look at and be contemplated. That's just unglazed earthenware. And clay still just seduces me when it's unglazed. And if you can find a beautiful clay that fires to temperature and looks that gorgeous, that doesn't always need glaze. I'm really interested in the industrial age, industrialization. The idea of America at the time when we came up with things like steel, and we sort of ruled the world with all these new inventions and machines, and everything was so exciting, and big cities were prospering, and no one thought about pollution. This was just, this is Vernon Hillenbecker, which a lot of you all know. They find a way to capture these images, and it's like the ugly, pretty thing. Is this disgusting or is this beautiful? I love cities, and I love cityscapes, and I love looking at the tubular kind of ducts and things. And so this kind of became hybridized into my own work. So that's a pouring vessel. Bernice Abbott is one of my favorite photographers. I've only recently started exploring photography, but I really only look at around 1920s, 30s era black and white, because it captures New York City on the up, or Chicago, or Detroit, or any of these cities in the United States that were just booming. And then, I incorporate it back in, again, forward and backward. So I always revisit ideas and try different surfaces. I then stumbled upon this idea, the wood burner. I don't know if you've ever seen these. They're in the Pacific Northwest, and they were used in the logging industry to incinerate the scrap wood. So before chipboard and particle board and press board was invented, we just burned this stuff and polluted the heck out of everything. But it also, they often caught fire and burned things down. The whole logging mill would go down. So they're now coming off the landscape. People are pushing these things over and taking them down. But I love the conical form, and I've always been interested in geometry and the shapes that are just real basic. So this was my first interpretation. 2 different vases. And then I went searching for some other thing to kind of feed into it, and I stumbled upon this place near my house, which is a reuse store. And this is just one little tiny part of it, but just tons and tons of old industrial waste. And I just kind of comb it and look for things. And often the inspiration isn't what I expect it to be. So this was just sort of like the hopper in the back that I was looking at. And then I just go biking through Berkeley. This is West Berkeley, where I live, about a block from my studio. So I go by and investigate this, and I just think about, why am I attracted to this kind of, again, the classic car, the corrugated cardboard or metal. And then here's how I bring that in to the previous slide that you saw. So it's just adding, always adding and trying to find my way. Things really started to happen about this point. I joined forces with Farron Gallery in Massachusetts, and she gave me permission, which was huge, permission to take my time and not crank out hundreds and hundreds of pots all the time. I was trying to survive in an expensive city, so I was making lots of mugs and bowls. And at this point, she gave me a show and said, I want 5 new ideas like the iron teapot. And I said, I've been working on the iron teapot for 10 years. That'll take me 50 years. But instead, I just hunkered down and really terrified, started to work. So this book on wood burners that I have is Daniel Maheyo is the author. He has these beautiful photographs of wood burners, and I like to work from the photo, because if I were to go to that location and look at the actual building, I would be overwhelmed with the detail, because I can't look generally, I look specifically. And so I looked at this picture and I thought, all right, I'll pop it back out into 3D. So I just worked like that a lot from image. I work from image all the time, actually. If I don't have a little model of a grenade, I have an image. If I don't have a spray can, I have an image. But I definitely have resource material all the time. And this was how I started dealing with the surface. Surface is a big thing in ceramics. It's torturesome. We don't always know what to do with our work, and we ruin it in the firing. So in an effort to be a little conservative, I did what I called Cajun style. I blackened them with like a... So these are my Cajun style pots. But blackening things gives it that feeling of like old silverware that's dirty, or jewelry that's turned colors. And I love that feeling of age and weather. So this is just to show you some process shots of how I get from point A to point B and further. Really wacky. This is like those wacky old iron teapots. The quirkier, the better. They sometimes make some goofy pots, but I just keep moving through it. And I was telling one of the students earlier today that Walter Ostrom in Canada, one of my other teachers of great influence, said to me, why is it, make more, where is it all? And every time he came into my room for a critique, he just said, where's the rest of it? Make some more. So I try to remember to just keep working. And I worked in a series of about 14 or 15 of these at once, not all at the same time, but maybe in a month time, kind of creating, and then another couple months of finishing. But it ended up being a show of a bunch of these. So I'm just going to kind of whip through the last few. This is how I work in a series. They're similar, they have different forms. And then they ended up at SOFA Chicago. And if anybody's ever been to Navy Pier in Chicago, there's this beautiful event called SOFA that happens every October. And down here at the bottom, my gallery, Farron Gallery, had this huge booth. And I had what was called a solo booth, which is supported by my gallery, yet I had the whole booth to myself, and I funded it. So we had an agreement, which was like taking a risk, that I would rent the booth, but I got to keep the money. And that's very unusual. So every gallery deals with things differently. But I had a very wise boyfriend at the time that said to me, if you're not willing to invest in yourself, why would anybody else? And that really struck me. So, you know, I've been known to pay half of an ad on the back of a magazine. If a gallery says, I'll pay half if you pay half. You know, sometimes you have to meet people halfway until you get to the point where people pay for everything. But I invest in myself, and I believe in myself, and that goes a long way. So here was my interior of the booth. And here's the introduction of the spray can series, which you'll see a little later on. This is a powerful image that really struck me. This is the image that inspired one of the teapots upstairs. So I was thinking a lot about my upbringing, living in the Steel City, Pittsburgh, and the steel mills and the history of, you know, industrialization in America, and now how we see things like, you know, pollution and the environment and the ozone layer. This is now usurping that feeling of joy about invention, right? So I wanted to do a series that just really struck a chord with people. So there's the Banksy China piece. These you'll see tomorrow, both sides. And that's, as you know, the wood burner series, right? Just continued. Only now I started to paint. And I haven't painted in 15 years. So this is new for me. Just all different scenes of what was known at the time as progress, you know? So we talked a lot about drawing and painting today during critiques with students, and I encourage everybody, I think, or almost everybody, to continue their drawing, because I wish I had continued my drawing throughout the time of undergrad to now. I actually really dropped it, and I just sketched in my sketchbook little tiny thumbnail sketches, and now I'm learning how to paint all over again. And what's fun for me is to try to translate around a three-dimensional form, right? So working on both sides, kind of under the handle, and then only painting in black, white, and gray because I'm still afraid of color. I think color creeps in a little later maybe, or maybe not in these slides. But this was my transformative piece, and ironically it's called the Transformer. But that is a transformer on the left that was GE's largest transformer ever tested. And it just happened to be in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and my gallery dealer, Leslie Farron, said, why don't you do a piece on Pittsfield, something historical? And she tipped me off about GE, and I looked it up and found that image, and I thought, that is a teapot if I ever saw one, right? I mean, it's so obvious. So this thing in the middle is the lid, and then that's the spout on the left. It actually pours better than my iron teapots, which is kind of funny, because this thing sold for the most expensive piece I've ever sold, $2,200, and I was so excited that I went and bought a really expensive bag. I was in New York City with it on my shoulder when I got the phone call it sold, and it transformed into a really nice handbag. There it is, finished. So I've made 3 of these. I don't like to exploit one idea so much that the collector that bought it feels like it's now diluted by many more. So I made 2 variations on it for other collectors. I think there's 1 remaining. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about, progress and failure. I recently started looking into sort of the disasters and tragedies of our history. And the Titanic is one that really kind of blows everybody's minds, right? We're never going to get over this. They're just now finding ways to photograph what's going on under the earth there, or the ocean. And I've never yet made the Titanic, but I have made the tugboats around it, because they're kind of the vessels that pull things to safety, right? So the Titanic is yet to happen, but I'll make it. The Hindenburg is what I'm really obsessed with right now in my own studio. I'm actually creating the Hindenburg. The thing about the Hindenburg, a lot of people have a misconception. There were only 97 people aboard when the thing went down, but that's the next image actually. But this one is one of those images of progress, right? We see this. This was like huge to everybody. This was a transatlantic vehicle built to bring people across the ocean. Everybody was so excited. Within less than a minute, the entire thing burned to nothingness. This was its virgin voyage cross Atlantic, and if you watch videos on YouTube, it'll blow your mind. It's just, this is where "Oh, the humanity" came from. That's what the announcer said when this went down. So I thought a lot about that, and I had to paint it. So I don't often examine what I'm making so much at the time. I think it's more important to just make from impulse and examine it a little more later. And when you put these kind of lectures together, you force yourself to really dig a little deeper. But I was just kind of blown away by the fact that this ended all Zeppelin travel. That was it. They're used as like drones and things like that, but they're not a means of travel. This scared the pants off everybody, you know. This is a scene of a skirmish, war. I was never interested in history, so you have to understand it's kind of mind-boggling that I'm totally interested in history now. So it's never too late to improve your own education. Okay, so here's a little bit of my collaborative work. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I'll show you some images. I was encouraged to collaborate with a painter named Jessica Hess, who paints images of street art. She also goes and tags and does wheat paste and things like that, but she's primarily a very tight oil painter. And neither one of us wanted to work together. She looked just like I did in that first picture when I met her. Gothed out, 10 years younger than me, chip on her shoulder, really good painter. I got her address, I went to her house. I had a ceramic spray can in my hand that was fired to temperature with no glaze on it. And she gave me so much attitude, and I just put it down on the table, and it just took her breath away. She said, "What is that, and what do I get to do with that?" And I said, "You get to paint on it." So this started a partnership that has blown our minds. We've learned so much from each other. This is my ceramic throne, life-size cone, and she's faux finished it with wood finish. And a little background about how the spray can obsession started. My studio now is in Berkeley, and for a long time it's Fisherman's Wharf. I had a really tiny studio. Now I have a really big studio. I mean, big for a city. It's not big if you live in like Kansas City or in the middle of nowhere, but for me it's large. And you know, we still reserve a space for the gallery in front. But most interesting to me when I moved into the building was the wall, because at this time my studio mate owned this building, and she made it a free wall, meaning anybody can come and paint on it. They stood there all day. They painted gorgeous paintings over and over and over. And everybody photographed classic cars in front of it, sports cars, models. Everybody in Berkeley was posing in front of this wall. And then it was bought by an Indian restaurant from us and my business partner, and they rolled over it with that red paint that was in the first shot, and it didn't even tell anybody. It caused uproar in Berkeley, but the best part is they went and tagged the back of it. So I thought a lot about it. I was never, you know, I'm not a street artist. I don't paint graffiti. I didn't grow up in the hood, but I love it, and it's always really spoken to me. So after the painting over of my building, I started collecting all the spray cans on the ground, because there were a lot that were left behind, and there was always a lot on the tracks. But I started making thrown spray cans, and everybody said, "Why don't you just cast those?" But I didn't want to cast them. It wasn't about making a recreated spray can like that. It was about experiencing the process of throwing these over and over again and really having a personal relationship develop. And I started to think of the can as the signature of the artist. You know, it's like if you've ever been to Venice in Italy, there's a big brush. It's like the signature of the artist is the paintbrush. Or, you know, writer might be a quill. Now, why can't a signature of an artist be a spray can, a paint bucket, right? Because maybe later on it will be. And I made a lot of these buckets. So these are just my own without the collaborative work, really realistic looking, but not like Victor Spinsky, who made amazing hyper-realistic paint things. I was just using the paint can as a model and kind of loosely interpreting it and making some clay-like dents that weren't necessarily metal dents, but you know, morphing the two together. And I started going bigger. So for the first time, I threw things and made them as tall as my electric kiln, which is basically 24 inches when wet. So that's where these came from, thrown in two parts, and I got a little more painterly. But I owe it all to Jessica Hess. In fact, all of the painting that I'm doing now, I really tip my hat to her, because she was the one that taught me to let loose and paint on the object. Because when I watched her do it, I was so envious. So she painted all of these. This is us getting ready to go to a show, shipping some stuff out, all boxed individually, which Leslie Farron taught me, and then boxed in other boxes. But this is just a glimpse of it. And here I'll show you some of these real quick. We photographed them in the alley where they originated. So this is bits of graffiti in San Francisco, photographed in San Francisco in front of the wall. And she luckily really appreciated the handmade quality of my work. She said, if this were, I wouldn't paint on a tin can. She said, that's like junk. And I wouldn't paint on a slip cast object because that's the next step up. It was like cheapening it. But she said, the weight of these thrown objects has a power and a significance to me that's worthy of the time. Because she spent a lot of time on these. So here's a series of them. We made a lot of work together. And it was really liberating for me because I got to make the work and then just hand it over and let her finish it. So, I mean, I never thought in my entire life I would collaborate with another artist. And now I have 3 collaborations going because what I learned from collaborating was 2 brains are better than 1. You know, artists are so independent. We always work alone. When you start to brainstorm with other people, your own ideas just go off the hook. So we had the opportunity to have quite a big show together. And she said, let's make a triptych. And she was just such a visionary all the time, 10 years younger than me, and saying, I see black and white, sepia, and color. And so that's what we did. And the thing about this is there's 3 canvases, 3 foot by 3 foot each. All the objects rotate all around. They all are painted all the way around. You can rearrange it. You can buy them separately. We tried all kinds of things. It's really tricky marketing this work because people aren't really understanding what's going on. And the works look so much like buckets and cans that people do think that that's what they are. So it's sort of been tricky. They also want to pick up the lid and, you know, they're fragile. But she's an incredible painter. And they are acrylic. They're not glazed surface, which I think collectors are often tripped up by a little. But I wanted her to be really comfortable. I didn't want to give her underglaze and say, try to paint this. So she just did what she did best and used her acrylics and her brushes, and it works great on porcelain. And she actually said she loved painting on porcelain more than her own canvases because it's harder. So you can get even a tighter surface. And there's the black and white series. This is her own character, Cocky Girl. That's what she wheat pastes around. And this is the last couple here. She's just a real talent and a real joy to work with. The pigeon will reappear in conversation here soon. Oh, that's right. I'm talking about symbology and coded meaning. I forgot. So this is a symbol for me, the pigeon. And I want to talk about the pigeon because people call the pigeon the flying rat, right? People think they're dirty, disgusting. They live in the city. What really turned me on to the pigeon was a video made by a friend of mine that was an animated video about, he made a whole film about pigeons being the only thing left on earth when the world had, and they were like marching into the feed store like little soldiers and getting their feed. And I thought, you know what, it's true, pigeons can live on garbage. And so I thought about urban furniture, and that's why I started making fire hydrants. I thought urban furniture is interesting. There's all this stuff you don't think about. A fire hydrant is on every corner almost, you know, everywhere in the country, and it's another life force. So I was making at this time 2-foot-tall grenades and 2-foot-tall fire hydrants and facing them off and thinking, wow, at this size, they both looked like figurative almost. And the grenade started to look figurative. And I would put them in front of each other and think about that. But the pigeon and the fire hydrant, they're friends, you know, they all hang out together. But the pigeon has so much more to it. So I started thinking about that a lot and researching them. And that was my first painting on a piece. So I painted that with underglaze. And Leslie Farron said it looked like a sticker. And I thought, boy, this takes me way back to painting when I could never fill up the background. I just like painted the foreground, and I'm still kind of stuck there. But these fire hydrants, really, I enjoy making them so much. No one buys them, but who cares? If you let that dominate your work, forget about it. So these are thrown in 7 pieces. I don't really enjoy making them, but when I thought about the pigeon, I thought about the dove. I thought about they're the same species. Now, why is the dove adored and the pigeon despised? They're both the same species. The dove symbolizes purity, all kinds of things. So I looked it up. Think about it. In Christian religion, we believe that Noah's Ark, you released the dove came back with a branch. So this is images you can find on the internet about that. Also, the pigeon, the carrier pigeon, was one of the most important parts of the First World War. They didn't have other ways to communicate. There's no text messaging. they released a bird and it carried a message. The carrier pigeon can find its way. It's kind of an amazing animal. So I looked into that a little bit more and found out they were awarded medals. I mean, G.I. Joe and Patty have like the most esteemed medal from the war, right? So there's all kinds of stories about this. But it just really got me thinking about that. So the wonderful thing about the internet now is that we can just dig further and further and further and deeper into these things. This is an image I found on the internet as well. It's frightening and it's kind of sexy. It's got this, it's also very androgynous. Like, this is a man. I thought it was a woman. There's such an elegance to the way that this man's holding the gun. And I actually, in my studio, have been making rocket-propelled grenades. I don't have any images yet because they're so far kind of failing. They work out great until the glaze fire. But I thought a lot about these weapons as well. And so I had an opportunity to work for a month at the Archie Bray last year, and I spent the entire month working on a series about Syria. So this is a year ago. Things hadn't even gotten that, they're bad, but they weren't bad enough that we are all talking about it. But I thought a lot about what was I trying to say? And the title is the only thing that kind of saves you here. Hit and run, denial. I'm not promoting war, and I'm not running over there to save the world either. I'm just trying to create some objects of contemplation that bring awareness to people, right? So having the last name that I have, I can't ignore what's going on. I don't want to be involved in it. I don't want to be arrested after this either. But I want people to think about what's happening. I mean, they're killing their own people. And so I made a grenade 2 feet tall, glazed it gold. Again, when I glaze something gold, I think it's iconic. This is like sort of making a permanent, serious object. This was in the biennial last year at NCO, which was a huge honor. But it just goes to show you that people respond to the power of this, especially when it's that big. But again, it took on a figurative quality. It almost looks like a bird, right? Getting down to the end here. So this is a little more recent, right? We don't have to see this. This is the thing that we forget. We hear about it on the news. We see clips of it. But these people that are living amongst us, like, the country's going down. It's just so sickening. So I make these pieces, and I hope they'll get seen. That's all you can do when you make your art. You're communicating. I think of art as a language. So many people speak many languages. There's writers. There's all sorts of ways of communicating. I am a visual communicator. This is Damascus. And these are the pigeons. So, this kind of image is horrifying, but the thing that, there's still, no one's sure what's going on. Was there chemical stuff? This is proof enough. So, ironically, I hate ending going down like this, but this is real life, right? So ironically, before the chemical attack on the Syrian people, alleged, I was making these. And just about 2 weeks ago, so I'm showing you greenware because I actually have never even fired them yet. They're that fresh. But this is something I was going to make tomorrow in class too, so I realize now you're already seeing it. But using the wheel to create something like this, it starts out like almost like a Mei-ping jar or I make like a traditional pot, and then I move it around and push it. And then I throw these extra little elements and add it on, and it makes this horrifying, terrifying, spooky head, And so this is my newest work. It's come a long way from Pottery 101, but I still see the wheel as an exciting tool for invention. There's so much possibility for me, just like no different from a CNC router or the 3D printers or whatever you're into. For me, the wheel continues to excite and inspire ideas in me. And I feel really lucky that I have that kind of skill to bring the reality out of that little ball of mud. And I was saying to somebody earlier today that I think ceramics is so amazing because you can make something that's like a new precious jewel or a runny glaze that looks like a gem or something sparkling like a diamond, or you can make dirt look worse. It's your choice. So all I can do is end with a symbol of hope and promise. So thank you all. I'm so honored that you invited me and came here and spent this much time with me, and I hope to see you all at the reception tomorrow. Thanks so much.